Hello. I'm going to be talking about myth, legend, and folktale. And this is good for 270, and you might use some of this in 250. I'm talking about this from the point of view of a folklorist slash anthropologist. People who study culture and study these kinds of stories in terms of their function in culture and what they do in culture and what people do with them. So I'm not coming from a literary point of view per se, but I'm coming from a more social sciences point of view, because everybody has their own idea what a myth is. So the first thing I tell my students is, okay, outside of this classroom, myth means falsehood. Like, oh, it's a myth that, chocolate makes you lose weight or whatever. And I tell them they can still use that however they want outside of my classroom, but in my classroom, that is not the definition we will be using. We will be using a scholarly definition of myth, which means something very specific. So the definition I give them is that myth is a sacred story, believed to be true in some fashion, that tells how the world came to be as it is today. So breaking that down, it's a sacred story. That means it is a special kind of story. It may not be sacred to you, it may not be your religious tradition, but it's sacred to somebody. It's somebody's sacred story. And in that sense, that means all the stories in the Judeo-Christian Bible are myths, as well as stories from Greek religion, Roman religion, Egyptian religion. They are all myths because they are a sacred story. Myth in and of itself does not imply falsehood or truth in this understanding of the term. So it's a sacred story. Number two, it's believed to be true in some fashion. And how I talk about that is that these stories are not told as fictional when they're told within a religious setting or when they're told as sacred. Yet, people in the Judeo-Christian tradition, we get very hung up on historical factuality. Most cultures around the world do not get hung up on this. So what I tell students is that myth is true with a capital T, because it is true about some enduring things about the human condition. The reason why we still care about these stories from any culture that is not our own is because they say something that is true in this kind of way about the human experience and the human condition. It may or may not be true with a small t, which means factual. And as a folklorist, I really don't care if it's true or false in this sense. What I care about is this sense. What does it say that is and something enduring about the human condition? So that's how it is believed to be true. It is true in that way, with a capital T. It tells how the world came to be as it is. A lot of scholars debate about this, whether that has to be part of it. The reason why I am persuaded by the arguments that say that is because you can interpret that rather broadly. So yeah, there are the cosmogonic myths which say, here's how the world started. But those are only one category of sacred stories. There's lots of other sacred stories too, but if you think about it, and I usually use stories that students already sort of know, hopefully. If you think about it, the flood story tells how the world came to be as it is now, because there's pre-flood and there's post-flood. People have made the argument that the stories about Jesus can be considered myths in this way because after Jesus, things were certainly different than before Jesus, if you are a believing Christian. You could even say stories of Moses are myths in this sense because for believing Jews, post-Moses, you have all the laws, he had contact with God, there's all this stuff. It's different than pre-Moses. So you can argue that, that tells how the world came to be as it is rather a broad category. A lot of students come to our classrooms and they think, well, people believe myths because they didn't know how the rain came to be or why the spring came and they made up this idiotic story, but now that we have science, we don't need this. And I sigh, and then I say, no, myths are about this. People a long time ago were no more or no less stupid than we are. They had their own form of scientific knowledge. It may be different than ours, but that's never been the true function of myth. Myth is never just explanatory. It can also have an explanatory function, but its primary function is to convey worldview ideas and to speak to these enduring truths about the human condition. So that's the definition of myth that I use in my classroom. A legend is something different, and I'll talk about, I'm going to talk about it now. I'm going to use the work of a scholar named William Bascom, and I give my students this schema that he uses, and then I tell them, because life is messy, things don't always fit into the schema. But let's look at the schema first, because it is useful. I'm going to have to erase this. How will I do that? I'm going to pop out a frame. I'm going to grab a tissue and erase it right now. Or not, because it doesn't erase. Oh, excellent. So I've just ruined this whiteboard, which is great. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to grab a piece of paper and do this. All right. So according to William Bascom, who is a scholar who has written about myth, he talks about, all right, you have myth, oh, and these don't break, which is just so awesome. This is just like in the classroom. So you have myth, you have legend, and you have folktale. Okay, I'm going to get another pen. All right. Nothing writes today. Beautifully written, huh? Okay, so what are the differences between these? What Bascom says is, first of all, you look at when do they take place. Myth takes place in primordial time. By definition, it takes place before things got to be as they are now. So it takes place in some other time, in illo tempore, in Eden, in the time before the flood, in the time before everybody could get saved, in the time before people knew about the Ten Commandments, whatever it is. It's the time before. Legend takes place in historical time. And I'm using that a little broadly, but it's the time when people roamed the earth like we are today. It's not in a past time. It's time just like it is now. It might have been 2 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, but it's historical time. And folktale, well, when does folktale take place? And I ask my students this, and I finally get them to say, well, it takes place once upon a time. So it takes place, I'm just going to put, whenever. You don't start Cinderella by saying, in 1592, in the kingdom of France, we don't situate folktales in historical time. They are in an amorphous time. So that's one way that they're all different. So, okay, who is in these things? Well, who's in myth? Well, obviously divinities. So divine people are in myths. Sometimes they interact with human beings, sometimes, but they're mostly divine folks who are in myths. In legends, it can be people, sometimes divinities. I'm thinking of the Trojan War. Sometimes divinities can come and talk to people, but it's mostly human folks. And some supernatural people like Merlin or some divine folks might show up. In folktales, again, it's kind of everybody. It's human people, but it's also Puss in Boots. It's like fairy godmothers. It's, witches. So I'm just going to put whoever. This is not William Bascom's term, those are mine in that one. Then you get to the truth value. Are they considered truth or fiction? So myths are considered true with that capital T. Legends are considered true, like they're supposed to be historically true. What we say about legends is that a legend is a story that is told as true. Whether or not you believe it or not, it's told as true. And it takes place in the world as we know it today, and it usually reflects ongoing current concerns. So there can be saints' legends, there can be legends about heroes, there can be urban legends, not urban myths. And I tell my students I will smack them upside the head if they say urban myths, because an urban myth would require that God or Jesus be part of it. So unless Jesus is walking down the street, it's not an urban myth, it's an urban legend. I get really antsy about this. They're told as true, we'll put it that way, whether they're true or not. It's told as true that George Washington slept here. It's told as true that Arthur pulled the sword out. We don't say Napoleon, suddenly the wizard appeared to Napoleon, although we do say it about Arthur, so that's kind of interesting. we tell it as true. Folktales, we all know, unless you're under the age of 2, that folktales are fiction. And we enjoy them because they're fiction. We don't go looking for the grave of Red Riding Hood. We don't go looking for other things that show that folktales are true. They're fiction, and we enjoy them like fiction. All right, are they secular or sacred? Well, myths are obviously sacred. It's in the definition. Legends can be either sacred or secular. Because for the people who argue that the stories about Jesus are legends because it takes place in historical time, it's a sacred legend. All the saints and bodhisattva stories are sacred legends because they take place in historical time about actual human beings. Then there's secular legends, like George Washington throwing the coin across the Potomac, or historical people doing various things. And then there's also urban legends, which involve plausible but far-fetched events that always take place at least one town over and are communicated to you by a friend of a friend. Those are, which folklore is called a fof, a friend of a friend. It's the hallmark of an urban legend. But urban legends are told as true. They're set in contemporary times, and they reflect our ongoing current concerns, like that people will hide out in the parking areas of malls and slash your Achilles tendon, which is an urban legend my dad always forwarded to me on his email whenever he was worried about me. And folktales, they are secular. So this is an excellent model to sort of test a story against and say, okay, can you make an argument that it fits into one of these? And I'm willing to be convinced. And yet, because life is messy and human beings are messy, and that means our stories are messy, we get lots of messy stories that don't quite fit here and don't quite fit there. And one of the favorite ones that I like to tell my students is a story from Italy, which involves Jesus and St. Peter wandering around. And so Jesus and St. Peter are wandering around one day, and Jesus says, Peter, you got to get married. I'm tired of you not being married. It's really, you need to get married. And Peter says, well, I haven't really met the right woman. And Jesus says, listen, the next woman we come across on the road, you're going to marry her. And he goes, okay. So this woman comes down the road, and she's, she's like maybe 40, and, she's not bad looking and everything, but Peter was hoping for something different. And so he says, well, I don't really want to marry her, Lord. And Jesus says, all right, you're really picky, but all right, the next one that comes down the road, you've got to marry her. And Peter says, okay. And so this other woman comes down the road, and she's in her mid-60s, and, not bad, but she's got gray hair, and she's not going to procreate, and, she's having a little arthritis problems in her hips and stuff. And Peter says, yeah, I don't want to marry her either, Lord. And Jesus goes, boy, you are really picky. All right, the next one that comes down the road, you are marrying her. And he's like, all right. So the next one comes down the road, and she's like 90 if she's a day, and she's got like scraggly, like one tooth, and she's got like hair coming out of her chin and no hair practically, and she's like all bent over. And Jesus says, well, here's your bride. And Peter's not all that happy, but he allows, Jesus to marry them. And they walk on into a village, and there's a sign outside of one of the buildings that says, the master blacksmith of the world. And Jesus says to Peter, well, that's kind of presumptuous of this guy, so let's go talk to him. So they go and talk to him, and they say, well, you're the master blacksmith of the world, are you? And the blacksmith says, yeah, I am. And Jesus says, well, how about a little contest? And he's like, sure, I don't mind a contest. And so, let's try and do the same thing, and we'll see who's the master. He's like, great. So Jesus says, I'll go first, because I'm the challenger. So he takes Peter's new wife, and he throws her on the anvil. And he takes a hammer and starts hammering away at this old woman, and hammer, dunks her in the water like you would with a sword or something, and then takes her out, and suddenly she's this gorgeous 22-year-old. Now Peter's really happy, and Jesus says, there, blacksmith, repeat that. So the blacksmith says, wait, and he goes and he gets his mother-in-law, and he sticks her in the fire, and then he puts her on the anvil, and he hammers, sticks her in water, and he kills her. And Jesus says, well, you're not the master blacksmith of the world, are you? And he has to concede that he's not. And I think Jesus then heals the mother-in-law, but I'm not sure. So I asked students, well, what is this story? Make an argument to me. Is it a sacred story because it's got Jesus and St. Peter in it? Is it a legend because it seems to take place, in sort of more ordinary time? Is it a folk tale because it follows the rule of 3, because Indo-Europeans love 3s, and everything happens 3 times in a joke, in a folk tale. We always know there's going to be a third thing in there. And because some of the things are kind of fantastical and not really realistic. Make an argument to me. And it kind of you can make an argument for each of those in different ways. And it's really more of a folktale, but it's got elements of the others. So that's the sort of thing that I set them. So that's my spiel on myth, legend, and folktale, and how we can try and categorize them if we're brave.